I would firstly like to start this session by thanking the Center for Global Health Policy and Politics, and of course our equity for bringing us together to continue these critical conversations through dialogue. And this particular webinar is titled Innovation, Not Accommodation, Advancing Justice and Equality. We continue to defend and advance human rights in increasingly hostile environments across the world. And so I ask us today, what role does advocacy play in public health and in medicine? How do we work? How do we do the work of dismantling systems of power? And how can we build a more just and inclusive future for all people everywhere? Key to the foundational framework of reproductive justice as a movement, as a global movement now, is intersectionality. It's a demand for continuous analysis of the power asymmetries that produce certain conditions of privilege and systemic exclusion. Factors such as racism, ethnic and caste systems, marital status, migration status, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, disability are some of examples of how one's locality determines who is seen as credible, as entitled to pronounce on matters, for example, in global health and SRHR, on matters of fertility, access to contraception, abortion care, and the right to make decisions about one's body. It's important to locate this conversation within a human rights framework, and the right to health as a human right provides us freedoms and particular entitlements, and autonomy is a central principle to that. However, far too often, we know state and non-state powers are constantly contesting where autonomy lies. And we know that state power is often executed in ways that erase international human rights law, ignores international human rights law, and especially accountability mechanisms, both within countries and throughout different regions. And we've seen lately how foreign policy has already affected the ways in which states see international solidarity and global health aid, directly impacting the ability of people to access their sexual and reproductive health rights. Of course, one of the greatest retrogression in reproductive justice through how courts are used and litigation is used has been the political environment that enabled the overturning of Roe v. Wade in 2022 in the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization decision. These actions are not isolated, they are a form of structural violence, and they are enforced, they are endorsed by state and non-state actors through the courts and have a disproportionate impact on particular people. And us on this call and my panelists very shortly will get to share some of those lived experiences in a while. But in the context of a global health system, in the context of global systems of governance, we must deeply interrogate what we have inherited. We must look at the deeply unequal hierarchies. And so, as a result, in fulfilling my mandate as a United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to health, I decided already in 2020, when I was appointed, to use anti-racist and anti-colonial analysis, but to also employ intersectional frameworks as I advocate and come up with recommendations for substantive equality in order to achieve health equity, but also the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health for all people everywhere. And many of you may have heard me say this before, and I continue to repeat that the practice of medicine itself is a protection of human rights. And we've seen in the ways that we seek intersectional justice that we can no longer ignore what happens in a clinical setting. And as we are joined here today by incredible speakers, people that I know well, that I'm very excited to be joined by in this webinar, it is a critical time to see what lessons we can learn by not retreating, by actually pushing past, and what I often argue is beyond the pushback, so that we set our own agenda. This time requires a level of innovation, cross-movement building, and advocacy practices that will really take us to justice and equality. And I'm honored to introduce you all to our guests. First, we have Kerigo Dada, who's a PhD candidate very soon. We're just counting weeks now, if not months. And she's a legal support network coordinator at Mama Network as well. Someone who's also been dedicated to SRHR in the Africa region. And secondly, we have Michelle Yesudas, who's a collaborator for legal dignity in Malaysia, someone who also I know previously from having doing this work in sexual and reproductive health rights. And something different, I suppose, today is that I've asked my panelists, and welcome to you both. Just say hello and meet yourself, say hi. Um, I've asked you both to prepare as we start a piece of poetry, and I think this is a bit different, but it speaks to my state of being in terms of mental health. I need to approach work differently, do work differently because everything just seems so overwhelming at the moment. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we started to share for us what's currently moving us? And for me, I went to somewhere, to a place that's quite familiar when I was choosing what to share, which I will in a minute. But maybe you just want to, as you introduce yourself, Michelle, maybe start off by sharing with us the piece of poetry that you have prepared for us. And you can maybe give us a little bit of a context, a little bit of a history onto that. And then we will go on to just the first questions. And then I will also get to share, and so will Kerigo. So before I go on with the first question, I think I want to just start by saying, please share with us your poetry and contextualize it for us. Thank you. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much. And hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. And I think I will start by explaining the poem because it's linked to the rest of the answers I will give. Currently, for context, I am still living on the Thai Myanmar border. I'm a Malaysian national, but I have been working with the refugee community. And one of the biggest we've also just experienced earthquakes that have been ongoing with magnitude ranging from 8.5 and even most recently aftershocks. And so it's intertwined with aid and being uprooted and seeking asylum in places that are extremely hostile or welcoming. It's also dedicated to my friends who have been seeking asylum. It's penned by a very close friend of mine, Yasmin, if you're on here. Yasmin Ullah is a Rohingya woman refugee, and she's been an advocate and a poem, and one of the people who have really made me understand that in a struggle we are all equal and there is no pity, only respect. And so I've got her permission to read this out because this is also really dedicated to all the people that have come to my country, Malaysia, for hope, for help, and sometimes are not given kindness. And this is in a way an apology, so I read it out in her words. So, a part of home I never got to see: genocide, tyrants, thieves. Knowing my heart will always ache for a touch of this faded memory, a little bit of connection, family. What price should I pay to get back this stolen history? It's called Uprooted by Yasmin Ullah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And as a South African connecting obviously from South Africa, I, resonate a lot with the whole piece, but that part about to get back the stolen history. And so much of our history remains trapped in these lands. And so much of blood has been spilled on these lands, right? And so much of what makes us who we are. And I think maybe in a way our destinies were already predetermined for us just by people who experience the things that we experience. And so just to say thank you very much for sharing that and getting us going in terms of power and what power means. Um, and I think memory, there's something important that we unintentionally perhaps are serving also today, right? It's the memory, and for me, memory also links very much to dignity because a lot of what happens in terms of violations to our bodies and the work we do remains in silence, remains invisible. And there is something about, we know, biological memory, right, that lives generations and trauma lives generations. But I think by the same token, joy can live through those kinds of generations, the same way we understand generational trauma. And so part of what I think about being innovating and not accommodating is also rejecting the ideas of who we are, right? That are being painted by those in positions of power who can tell that story, who can control the media in different ways. And so, what does innovation and not accommodating looks like? And so, thanks for inspiring just those initial thoughts for me. Just the links between the fight for one's land and one's history, but memory and dignifying ourselves in telling these stories out loud. So maybe in the first question, then just give you a little bit of a break to recover from that first intervention. Kerigo, let me come to you. You've worked in sexual and productive health rights, in research, in academia. You've been involved in different campaigns. You now have a particular role at Mama Network. Explain to me, in terms of your experience, what are the legal or advocacy strategies that have proven effective in overcoming some of these power struggles that we speak about? I mean, we are perhaps on this call understand intersectionality, and we understand truly not leaving no one behind means, right? From sex workers, people who use drugs, people who experience homelessness, people in, difficult migration situations, LGBTQ plus people. So with all of those marginalized people um, identified and knowing how difficult it is, just period, right, to just live. So what would then a legal or advocacy strategy look like to overcome these obstacles that we continue to face as those types of people?
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much, Dr. T, for that particular question. And to answer it, I'd just like to say that in many of the SRHR contexts that I've worked in across Africa, it has become increasingly clear that the real issue is not simply whether courts exist, right? Because we're talking about this within the context of accessing courts, but who has access to them, under what conditions, and whether these courts are capable of even delivering meaningful justice, especially for those people that are marginalized. And so, with all these things in mind, how do you even begin to shift this landscape from an advocacy perspective? And in my experience, one thing that has emerged as a powerful tool is community-led engagement, right? So in many of our conversations, it's important to center the stories of the people who experience these violations. It is important to have this story being told by the narrative holders. So this particular angle of community empowerment, which involves training grassroots activists, paralegals, and people who are often affected by these things themselves, it helps people know their rights, document violations, and navigate the legal system. So this model of work, because it builds trust from it builds trust from the inside. It reduces fear of the courts and it creates a sense of urgency. People are more likely to open up to legal remedies as opposed to what we have been seeing in the past, that now with increased community empowerment from a legal perspective, we are able to bring narrative holders to this conversation, and they are the ones who push this discourse for themselves. The other thing that has emerged as a very, very strategic advocacy tool has been strategic litigation, coupled with movement building. So strategic litigation can be a powerful tool, but only when embedded within a broader movement. So it's not just about winning a court case. It's about shifting narratives, building public awareness, and creating legal precedent. So a good example is the Botswana High Court decriminalization of same-sex case. That was one powerful example of strategic litigation, where it was not just about going to court, it was about preparing the society to actually see LGBT persons as human beings who have dignity and who are equal in standing before the law. And when you look at how that campaign was carried out, from the court system, working with the judiciary, engaging with media, right? Because it's also important to empower media, because media carries a story, and the story that the media carries shapes how society receives this information. Another important advocacy strategy has been exploring alternative accountability mechanisms. Yes, we typically, as people in the legal profession, we typically want to go to court, but we must always have at the back of our mind that litigation in particular is an adversarial thing. So how do we engage in these advocacy campaigns in a way that is constructive, not constructive, but in a way that builds relationship? So we need to explore, we have been exploring alternative approaches like there's ADR, there's also just working with other stakeholders, right, to help us understand or adopt a health, for instance, with health issues, developing a health systems approach that we bring all these stakeholders on the table, have a conversation so that we don't have to end up going to court in order to seek justice. Lastly, I would say coalition building and cross-movement advocacy. This is very, very important because we are intersectional beings, and because we're intersectional beings, whatever how we experience power is different, but we are all united in the fact that we experience all these things differently depending on our social locations. So it is important that when we are designing our advocacy campaigns, from what we have seen, having all these stakeholders that play a key role within this framework of sexual and reproductive rights, from health professionals to community activists, lawyers, researchers, all of us coming together to build a movement that actually understands that when LGBT persons are attacked, it is just not them. It is everybody else because we exist in multiplicity. So those are some of the things that I have observed in my work. Thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Karigo, for that. And perhaps similar question to you, Michelle. The kinds of strategies that you've seen effective in overcoming your obstacles, and I think your geographical location itself, right, is quite significant, and maybe you can speak a little bit more from that perspective as well. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. T. And also, I just wanted to say thank you to Kirigo because I think the both of us encompass quite a large footprint across the world. So, in terms of legal and advocacy strategies, I'm very mindful that many of our panelists here from South Africa and come from a history of jurisprudence of law that works. And I think coming from Malaysia and Myanmar, it's examples of how much one small court case can change things, but then also how sometimes when you do not have an independent judiciary, especially in Myanmar, where you're currently having a conflict situation, what's important to be built because the medical healthcare system, public healthcare system is close to being annihilated in Myanmar. And in Malaysia, a lot of stigma and mystification and misinformation is what seems to be a great barrier to access to SRHR. So one thing I've noted is that legal strategy, which is almost similar to what Krigo has said, firstly is evidence-based, pushes towards SRHR and creating and collecting nuanced stories of barriers and also how it's been denied and then recognition of the universality of these barriers. These are the most important things, I think, because what is required across the world, but specifically in Southeast Asia, is debunking myths. Because people in power cling very closely to old myths that should be thrown away 20 years ago. And so, firstly, looking at examples of working in Myanmar and people who are seeking asylum, we have to look at information and conflict settings are specifically very scarce. It's also history of internet shutdowns, not being a stranger and connected to power, gender dynamics, and also more often than not, horrific stories take years to surface. You have gang rapes of women, Rohingya women, and then stories of men being raped sometimes take longer to surface because of the dynamics of gender. And then you also have men and women who are in armed groups, and those stories coming out are extremely traumatic and difficult. And if you do not have those stories coming to fore, you do not have needs being met. And then also, one thing we started talking about is that while we have the right to health as an inalienable universal human right, as we know, with the funding cuts, funding and resource availability is becoming our direct threat towards making human rights available. So, from my own experiences, when you go to even If you go to even the largest camps, which shouldn't even exist for refugees, or support resource availability, access to water, restrooms, dignity, kids in peace and conflict are already challenging. So what I found is that community-centric health responders in rural areas are extremely, and they have history on their side and they are always able to respond. But then you have something like funding cuts where there have been people immediately after 24 hours of the funding cuts being pulled by America, because they were historically the largest funder for Myanmar and in crisis. There was already one death on the border for community health providers. And so this is often rarely acknowledged, and so this is something, and it's always silence on this side of the world, because Myanmar remains the most underfunded crisis in the world, with 22% of humanitarian response being fulfilled. And earmarked funds do not take into account the earthquake and the funding cuts. So I thought of just using this time to amplify that. And the second part, about my home country, another jarring example would be how the police relies on power and outdated penal code law. So, for example, our Socialist Party had actually taken a really important step, announcing that they want to do a workshop called Pride Care, Queer Stories in Sexual Health Awareness. And this is such a major step for Malaysia because people don't talk about any form of access to health. And more often than not, if you have to go a pap smear, people ask whether you're married. And so the degree of misogyny, despite us being very urban, the police were actually investigating the people who were going to do the talk. And it was very simple, where these were penal code offenses triggered because people wanted to talk about access to sexual health. And so the main link that I found is, firstly, we need new information, and then trust. We need to start debunking myths, relying on modern science, evidence-based information, and also really being critical about those who hold power and how they still subvert really critical right to health on the basis of culture, authority, religion. And these things remain in place today, regardless of how modern a country is. And the second simple answer would just be an independent, trustworthy legal system. Because in an independent legal system, you would have actions for people who have raped women or people, and those laws would not be used to clamp down on SRHR information that is very easy to be accessible. So yeah, these are just these two things. How trustworthy is the healthcare system serving its people, and how independent? And it's often very chilling. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I think um, you and Kirigo have spoken about community-based located initiatives. You've both spoken to the level of trust in different ways. And I think you bring up an issue of resourcing, that you already have areas in the world where even before particular crises get exaggerated or escalated, that the support they're already receiving was already not enough. But now, when you add like a crisis like an earthquake, for example, the needs of the people obviously increase that much more. And something that strikes me in as people, of course, on Kerigo and I, our respective countries, and the kind of protests that young people have been embarking on, right, for accountability, because there's a feeling that even the systems that are there don't even listen or don't respond and show up in the right way, right, for civil society to feel heard and seen, which also tells me that there's a different kind of innovation. Either we are being forced into it or we are just adapting into it. But the use of social media, for example, as a space where a lot of contestation happens, but a lot of good things also happen. And I'm thinking, on the one hand, right, the anti-rights, the anti-women, anti-gender movement, and how they have found like this hollow space in social media to just, yeah, go about in those ways that I feel are anti-human rights. But on the one hand, we can also be innovative, right? And not accommodate or just give space to all of these anti-human rights factions to just take over. So I'm trying to think now, as we're thinking about innovating, as we thinking about setting our own agenda, what are some of those trustful partnerships coming from, right? And you both spoke about community, which is, I think, is really the basis for all of this. Where else do we create new movements? Where is the space for collaboration, right? And what are those strategies looking like, taking into account that litigation is expensive, but for a lot of things, especially around SRHR, it's probably like our last lifeline. So how do we get resources pooled, right, to continue to strategically litigate, even in these really and I think scarcity is made, right? Like this sense that there is less to go around. It's a manufactured thing. There isn't all that scarcity. When you look at how much the anti-human rights movement is funded into the millions and millions of US dollars just in the east of Africa alone, you will know that there's no issue of scarcity here. So how do we speak to funders, for example, in supporting the kind of work we need to do to show up for the moment? So it's a lot of questions there for both of you. Maybe let's go to Kerigo and let's hear some of the tactics, the new innovative ways, and thinking broadly across society, including social media. How do we build these movements? Because I think for me, it's also about this idea of intergenerational feminist advocacy, and how do we continue with that in the setting where we know that we are not just being attacked by maybe within the unilateral system, where people are just saying, women's rights are not fully human rights or autonomy is not fully ours, but even the resource cuts are themselves a form of attack. So how do we go forward?
Thank you so much, Dr. T, for that. And thank you, Michelle, for your intervention. And I like what you have highlighted with regard to what has been happening in Kenya and South Africa. But before I go into that, I think it's also important to highlight that we are at this particular point in time, we are just not dealing with misinformation from the anti-rights movement. We are facing strategic, well-organized disinformation campaigns aimed at dismantling gender justice and sexual and reproductive rights. And for me, this is something that if you look at research from as early as 90s, people like Peter Kaoma have written about this, documenting how anti-rights actors from the US and Europe have always come to Africa, like in a transnational way, to try and counter the realization of reproductive justice, particularly targeting conversations around adolescents' access to comprehensive sexuality education, abortion, and all that, right? So for us, as people in this space. So the question is, how do we respond to all these things without all this attack that we are facing, without amplifying the lies that they are currently perpetuating? And I think for me, I would say first we must avoid amplifying the disinformation. We cannot repeat the lie, because when we repeat the lie in order to try and maybe justify a point, in that clarification, we are actually reiterating some of these things. So how do we just focus on our own messaging? And I think that's what I'm trying to say. We need to focus on our own messaging. I feel like we are spending a lot of energy and time monitoring and reporting, and it's important. I get that. But we need to move beyond monitoring and reporting to actually taking action, because they are doing it. And one way I think we can do this is by how leveraging digital technologies. And I witnessed how the social media was used to create awareness during the Gen Z protest in Kenya last year. And I sat and thought to myself, what a powerful use of social media. The way civic education was conducted, breaking down a finance bill in a way somebody at the grassroots level will tell you, I know how this tax on something up there is going to affect me having food at the table. And I thought, how about we make use of these spaces? If I, as Kerigo, am not good at being on TikTok, how can I work with somebody who's good on TikTok to actually break down this conversation to people and create awareness and help people understand that, you know what, an attack on sexual and reproductive rights, issues around reproductive justice, is not just about me, it's about everybody. It has human rights implications, it has social economic rights implications, and we have to see that this is an onslaught that is politically instigated, like what we are seeing now, right? The far right is riding on this campaign. So I think that's one thing that I believe is important for us in terms of leveraging digital technologies. And I'd also like to highlight that as we use the digital space that we have, it's also important for us to adopt risk mitigation strategies as we um, use these platforms, because a lot of us right now are exhausted mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, because every day you wake up, there's something new that's happening. And you raising your voice right now in support of a particular issue is a risk to you. It's a physical risk, it's an emotional risk. So as activists in the space, it's also important for us to look at how do we safely use these spaces? How do we navigate the social media that we have in order to continue pushing the narrative, but as at the same time protecting ourselves. The other thing would be, I feel it's important that we now start taking bold steps when it comes to holding some of these platforms accountable. As like what has been happening from last year with people now shifting from, I refuse to call it X, Twitter to Blue Sky. I think that was a powerful move. So just like, how do we come up with systems where we hold duty bearers accountable? Yes, and lastly, I'd just like to say that we really need to move beyond monitoring and reporting. Yes, that's a grounding part, but we need to act because we know they're well resourced, they're well organized, we know their tactics, we have written papers around what they're doing. So what do we do now in a way that it's not about us waiting for them to act, but we are also proactive. We need to get into these conversations. I know for quite some time, those of us on this side of the human rights conversation have always been like, oh, let's not use certain tactics, but maybe we may need to renegotiate because the people that we're dealing with really they don't care. And so how do we engage in innovative tactics while still doing it ethically and in a way that we still remain very, very ingrained to our core values and principles. About funding, I think we also have to have these conversations around alternative sources of funding. And can the funding that people receive, can they not come with conditions? We can't have people now we're in a problematic space where now you can't really say something because it means this. So how do we develop creative ways of continuing the conversation in a way that also we do not give up our autonomy working in this space? Thank you, and over to you, Dr. T.
Thank you very much, Kerigo. And I have lots of ideas and things to say about funding and funders, especially in global health. But let me hold that for the second part of this conversation because maybe for those who joined us a little bit late, I had invited Michelle and Kerigo to prepare a piece of poetry, and Michelle has already shared with us, and she's kindly dropped the link in the Q&A in the chat for people to be able to access the poem that she shared. And I'm going to take this opportunity now to share what I have prepared with all of you. And it's a longish one, but not too long. And after this, we will continue with our conversation. I think as we are trying to innovate and find different ways of showing up to the space and what's required in terms of advocacy, we ought to also be kind to ourselves and also realize that we are also just people trying to solve really difficult problems in the world. And one of the ways that I thought would be great for this intervention today, for this webinar, would be just to share with all of you some poetry, something unexpected. So here goes mine. It's titled A Litany for Survival by Audre Lorde. For those of us who live at the shoreline, standing upon the constant edges of decision, crucial and alone. For those of us who cannot indulge the passing dreams of choice, who love in doorways coming and going, in the hours between dawns, looking inward and outward, at once, before and after, seeking a now that can breed futures, like bread in our children's mouth, so their dreams will not reflect the death of ours. For those of us who were imprinted with fear, like a faint line in the center of our foreheads, learning to be afraid with our mother's milk, for by this weapon, this illusion of some safety to be found, the heavy footed hoped to silence us. For all of us, this instant and this triumph, we were never meant to survive. And when the sun rises, we are afraid. It might not remain. When the sun sets, we are afraid. It might not rise in the morning. When our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. When our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. When we are loved, we are afraid love will vanish. When we are alone, we are afraid love will never return. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard, nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. Yeah, so that's my contribution today, because that's where I am. And that is too familiar. So I don't know if to be sad for myself or to celebrate that there is something out there to hold and to make meaning of life. But I think that that's really what it is. And just coming from what, Michelle had shared earlier, and with this particular piece, there's a string there around power and silencing, but the undeniable fight back, the undeniable, non-extinguishable, right, desire to be and to be seen. And I think this is part of what the work is. It's ultimately to have everyone have the opportunity to create from themselves the life, right, of their choosing, and to use human rights as a tool to protect, to respect, to fulfill the right to health, because we know that as a human right, the right to health unlocks many other human rights. And that dignity is really central to all of that. But before we can do any of that, we really do have to find ourselves and our voice. And sometimes we are the ones who need time out, and we need others to speak up for us and to advocate for us. And how much of that in the movement do we do? How much of supporting of each other do we actually do? And how much resources are aimed at making sure that the humans who are doing the work are themselves taken care of and able to do this work, because it requires longevity. I mean, the kinds of resources that Kerigo you were speaking of, we know they're unrestricted, right? And yet feminists who are doing human rights work, who are human rights defenders, who are working, of course, in some of the situations like Michelle is working in the humanitarian settings, are being asked, to jump all sorts of hoops to prove that they deserve these kinds of resources. And yet we are fighting against systems of power and oppression that neither of us created. And so there's a bit of an injustice there as well, I think, in how resourcing and funding is thought of in global health. And, I said earlier on, I have a lot to say. And I think a lot of it actually isn't designed to end injustice, and to stop the power asymmetry, and to support communities claiming their power. It a lot of the time it makes people passive. The same way that HIV funding came with conditions that if you receive it, you can no longer give information, advocate, provide services, or even work for safe abortion access, for example, or work to decriminalize sex work, for example. Those were already fracturing movements. Those kinds of conditions that these resources and these grants and the money comes with was already fracturing our ability to be innovative, and I think put us at the back foot of how we find ourselves in these kinds of situations today, where we are so utterly desperate, and trying to be innovative in how we find resources. I'm going to look in the Q&A because there are some people who are interacting with us. and in no particular order, but I think Michelle, you were the last to speak. So if I can give you this first one. Um, it's Simone from Rwanda. They're an SRHR activist, and she wants to know what is the role of AI in SRHR driven progress, or sharing experiences, or that you can share experiences of any intervention through AI practices. And I think perhaps this is one of the other innovative ways of being confronted with AI and all of these technologies. And so, what does it mean for SRHR, but how do you view it in terms of interventions and success?
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's the presence of AI and also with SRHR. And if you look at the situation of conflict, for example, I think it underscores the importance of having a human being at the center of our advocacy, at the center of also the data collection. And a very good example would actually be collecting information about SRHR. It always requires a human experience. So I do think in terms of volume, in terms of data, but it always requires a human-centric approach, a human-centric check. Because an example would be in Myanmar, you also have ex landmines and unexploded ordnances in high conflict areas. And sometimes there are places like Meta and social media, more often than not, would like to combine AI with bots and using social media to highlight risks, ranging from landmines, ranging from dignity kit availabilities. And I do think that it's important to gather data with the volume and finding areas. But the most important thing is actually centering the human must still be part of the campaign. A human woman with lived experiences must still be overseeing the asks. And also, because if it's unchecked, I always like to say that the cost of you just not having a human being looking at the trajectory and the advocacy and the messaging behind it, you can just sometimes turn around and see an unimaginable explanation of your own home being retold by AI, um, with a new alternate history. And I think those, if you're Malaysian and you're on this call, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you're not careful, also with monitoring. And so to me, AI is really your ally, it's your friend, but you must keep it in check. And this is not for people who are Terminator fans, but because if you are not careful and centering the human and a human experience, you will end up with a complete rewriting of an alternate history that never existed about your country and your suffering and your own people. And why I come back to that is that when you look at the roots of totalitarianism or Hannah Arendt, and when you look at people who are being unhoused, unlanded, being made into refugees, it's the unwriting of your own history, the undoing of your own narrative. So that's why for me, AI is there, AI is great, but the human must always be at the center of all your stories because we do not want to be writing someone out of their history and their right to SRHR. Hope that answered the question. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Kerigo, do you have any thoughts on AI? Um, I wrote a report on digital health and SRHR, and I think one of the recommendations was especially around governance, right? About who owns people's data, and especially when you are talking about healthcare and SRHR in particular. We know discrimination and criminalization. To what extent will state actors use that information to continue to harass people, to jail people, to even execute people, right? Based on one of the grounds for discrimination that we know are wrong. But so I have, even more I think stricter views about AI in health generally. But for you, Kerigo, how do you see this?
I think we find ourselves in uncharted waters, many of us. And I'll speak on this with regard to comprehensive sexuality education, for instance. Right now, AI is there. adolescents, young people can go online and find whatever information they want. Whether or not the information is correct is another conversation. And that's what, like Michelle was highlighting, the importance of the human touch. So for me, in an upcoming book chapter written based on Dr. Thalen's report, I argue for the need to have a bridge between the digital developments that we are seeing and the analog, right? Because analog, I mean the curriculum-based sex education that adolescents and young people receive. Because what they're seeing within the curriculum sex education is that 1, 2, 3 is wrong, da, 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 da. Like there's a huge disconnect. So in school, they're going to receive a particular set of facts. When they go online, they receive a particular set of facts. So how do we bridge divide within an ecosystem that already criminalizes adolescents and young people for even being sexual beings? Because most of our laws perceive these people as asexual, but what we are seeing is very different. So AI does provide us an opportunity to strengthen provision of information and, or rather, access to information. However, we must underscore the fact that for many people across the world, especially in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, there's a lot that's still not at par with what's happening in the global north, right? So what does that mean when you have an influx of information on certain, on very important life issues? Uh, but what you're receiving on this particular in within the like the analog setup curriculum based education is very different. And then the other thing is who verifies the information that they're getting? That's another question, because then that also predisposes them to health risks. And then issues around privacy. With increased access to social media, digital technologies, there's a question of privacy. There's an ongoing conversation that I have seen right now around adolescents accessing adult sites. And it's just, you can see that the way things are shaping up, we need to have very, very well-informed conversations around who is governing the laws and policies that govern access to digital technologies and what this means and how do we navigate this ecosystem that we find ourselves in a way that is not disempowering but empowering for everyone, including young people. So those are my thoughts. But we continue learning from AI. It's here to stay, I guess.
Mm. And Shabna is asking about, barriers and challenges in adopting digital technology in advocacy. And I think, Kwerigo, you started to speak about the issues of privacy, but also who validates the information. And here's an important, part that I often talk about, that the same ways in which we find systems oppressive, discriminatory, stigmatizing in real life, if we do not then interrogate AI and technology and digital technologies in the same way, we are going to find that online solutions themselves are perpetuating the very harmful practices, harmful stereotypes. If the coder themselves is racist and ableist and homophobic and transphobic, right? They are going to produce code that exactly is that, is racist, is transphobic, and it's alienating to many people. And so it's not that digital technologies are devoid or they are this miraculous or neutral solution. They are actually, I think, even worse because there is no individual human to put accountability on. And many of these organizations are headquartered in the global north, where accountability is even more expensive. If litigation is expensive in Kenya and South Africa for everyday things, how are we going to start to litigate for data breaches, for privacy leaks and all of those things for these corporations headquartered in the global north? And then you add a layer of health and health data there. I think it does get very complicated very quickly. But I think human rights remain the way to go forward, because if there's meaningful participation of rights holders in every step of the chain, not just at implementation of technology, but at design, at prototype, at coding, at all of the different stages, I think we may start to get to a space where there can be some transparency, firstly, and perhaps some level of guidelines on how to be accountable and what kind of mechanism. Because right now, there isn't even a mechanism or a guideline on human rights on how to really have a global response to this. So, moving on to something else in the chat that other people brought up, which I think is important, is so they're thanking you guys for a thought-provoking conversation and criminalization specifically, right? And how sometimes we seek harsher laws thinking that the state will, in inverted commas, work for us, when in fact it ends up being used against us, especially in SRHR, given the context of anti-gender and anti-democracy actors. And I think, Erigo, you started to allude to this earlier on, that, for example, the anti-LGBTK plus rights people, those are anti everyone's rights, right? And I think I want to maybe talk about the key principles of human rights in this context of, dignity, autonomy, bodily integrity, having respectful therapeutic relationships in clinical care, but also having meaningful participation of civil society in policy making. If you can uphold those principles, I think you can see that criminalization has no place, because you are in effect criminalizing people for finding themselves in whatever vulnerable situation, right? That could be anyone, and criminalizing people for just this bad set of cards that life gives them is not just only unfair, but it goes against, those very principles of dignity and autonomy and bodily integrity. But to give it to you, to Michelle, and then back to you, Kerigo, perhaps, how do you view criminalization? And absolutely, people often wake up too late. They think, oh, it's just those sex workers or just those people who need abortions. But ultimately, an erosion on autonomy is an erosion on autonomy, period. It's only a matter of time until that autonomy affects you in your particular circumstance. But I will give it to Michelle, and then Kerry go after Michelle.
Sure. Thank you so much. And I think that's a very important question that will go to the heart of all of our work. Criminalization is the main barrier I think many people face. And speaking from the Southeast Asian perspective, coming from Malaysia, we still have the unnatural offences law that was given to us by our colonial masters, which I think it's no stranger to people in the chat. And then it took on a new life where it's now being owned by people in power as the standard of the reason why you can't have talks about sexual health and information about being queer or just safe abortions. And so these criminalization, more often than not, if it's in your jurisdiction, it's not brought by your own country. It's brought by your colonial masters, and then it's repurposed for the purpose of people in power. And I found that that's basically the barrier. If you see in Malaysia, that's the main way people actually deny healthcare to those most in need. And then in India and in Myanmar, as you've seen, that they've repealed and read down the 377 in India on the basis that it was used, and the same thing you can see in Myanmar, it was really used as a tool to invade people's homes, to harass a whole section of people. And there's another myth that I think people don't really talk about, is that it's not just LGBT people, it's perceived LGBTIQ people, because the state does not have a tool to know who's queer and who's not. And if you're in a criminalized situation, nobody will actually admit that they're queer or not. And then so you have many arrests. And if you are from Malaysia, you know very prominent people have been arrested for being perceived as queer with no proof till today whether the person is queer in the closet or in the community. And then you have stigma. And so that's where I would see that criminalization is the bare minimum, and that is something that we really need to battle. But at the same time, I also want to just raise, this is a place to raise out critically, how do we approach decriminalization? Because I do think over the years we have been approaching decrim as a scorecard. Oh, X countries have decriminalized, Y countries remain decriminalized, let's all decriminalize without nuance. And so sometimes it is treated like a soccer game, once again, I say the human is taken out of the equation, and you're just seeing countries as a win without really taking into account how it impacts people in their daily lives. Because many countries are hanging by a thread where it's a high court decision that has decriminalized. And I think a really good example would be was Namibia, and then I also think in the Caribbean, when then you suddenly have countries that with the right to appeal and the government appeals, it undoes centuries of well, decades of progress. And so when you have a decrim case at your feet, I do think there's a lot more work to be done as well to make sure that even if the case law is reversed, you must have a constitution that can combat against further rollback of rights. You must have accessible healthcare that will provide healthcare without discrimination, regardless of what law is in place. And I also just want to use this time to highlight the third point that I found very astonishing is that in countries that we have relied on, which has trailblazed decriminalization, especially in Africa, the fact that I think they were the leaders of decrim narratives and going away from colonial laws. But then suddenly people have been using modern parliaments to push through new and modern anti-LGBT laws. And that is quite frightening, I do think, because they are repurposing the decolonization of saying, we're going to make our own laws to oppress our own people with a modern day parliament. And that is going to be a very powerful narrative if seized by people in Asia, the right wing. I mean, in Europe, you can see it's actually copy paste the Kremlin laws as well as in Africa. It's a copy paste where now people are not talking about it. Is that I personally question whether or not you want to read the globe now as decrim and criminalized black and white, because you have European countries that are also now making it a crime to speak out, to be allies to queer people, to house people, and a lot of similarities with the global south. It's just not spoken about because we still have the binary of scorecards of wins and losses without centering how it really affects people. So yeah, I hope that answered your questions. I think it's a bigger conversation of how we approach criminalization and how we really give services to people in need the most and those most affected. Thank you.
Mm, absolutely. Kerigo, thank you, Michelle.
Thank you, Michelle, for that brilliant intervention. So I'm going to answer this in two parts, right? So the first part is that across many jurisdictions, people are criminalized simply for being who they are or for making choices about their bodies, whether that means engaging in sex work, accessing abortion, or just being in a same-sex relationship. So these laws that criminalize end up creating stigma and actively produce risk. And as a result, you now find yourself in a situation where survivors of violence or abuse often choose silence, not because they don't want justice, but because stepping into a courtroom could mean arrest, exposure, or retaliation. And so in such environments, the legal system often knows safety. Criminalization is a very, very big challenge. And criminalization, like you said, like Michelle, you said, it's these are things that we've inherited from our colonial masters, and a number of them have moved away from these laws that criminalize. So now what we're having is now a perpetuation of these criminalization laws by our own systems that are in place. We need to challenge these laws. We need to push for decriminalization. So the second part of my answer is how are we going about it? It is important for us to approach decriminalization campaigns and strategic litigation approaches in a way that does not leave society behind. Yes, we can push for a law to be decriminalized and get a win in court in one instance, but then you can have a situation where another regime is in place and that same law is overturned, like what we are seeing happening in the US. And why are and what is the reason we are at this particular point? It's because I feel like we have taken awareness creation campaigns for granted. Yes, information is out there, but I don't think it is out there. It's a complicated phenomenon where I think if we are pushing for decriminalization, yet the society itself is not at par with where we are when it comes to understanding that everybody is deserving of to be here. Everybody has a right to dignity and their humanity to be respected. we are not going to make proper gains. So we need to, as we go about our campaigns to decriminalize, we need to assess what are the opportunity structures looking like, what the political opportunity structure, the social opportunity structure, and also the institutional structures that are there, such that when we ultimately get the wins, we know that society is at this level where they understand it's just not about a marginalized group, it's about all of us. So even if the regimes keep on changing, the society will always know that it's about them. So if it's not about who's in place and how they feel about a particular issue, and this is very, very evident when you're looking at how LGBT cases have been litigated in Kenya. So it was we go to people have gone to court and the cases have been raised. Like you can see there's actually a case that the laws that criminalize LGBT persons are redundant. So now, but you have challenges around the society, right? Even going to the court, you could see how people were being treated, the stigmatization that was around it. And then you have political interference. And in one of the judges even stated, "Oh, the society, this goes against the morality of society." Things that are, the usual arguments that surely do not hold any water anyway. So we have to make sure that, yes, as we focus on other advocacy strategies, litigation, and all that, that we do not leave awareness creation campaigns. Yes, it's tiring, but we constantly have to have these conversations. We have to make people understand what it means for person A to be criminalized. That if person A is criminalized, it affects me. So we have to go back to the drawing board and have those conversations from the grassroots level all the way up. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. T.
Thank you. And I'd like you guys to just think of your closing, wrapping up remarks. And of course, Kirigo, we owe you the opportunity to share with us your piece of offering of poetry as we look to wrap up our conversation. And just something from the chat that's coming up. It's around marital status, around globally how it determines how you are viewed as a woman. And they are using the title Miss and Mrs. As an example, speaking to, I think in one way we've said this without using the word patriarchy, right? That a lot of this controlling of people's bodies and contesting of autonomy lies in this idea of patriarchal control, and something that I've called patriarchal violence, right? Because of the repercussions of what it means. So yes, indeed, absolutely, patriarchy is one of the systems in society that continues to have a negative impact on all of us, people who are experiencing life, all of us who are gendered, whether you are a Mr. or a Miss or an MX or a Mrs. Patriarchy affects all of us. And the other comment was just about, funding for abortion interventions, especially in this climate of clamp down on SRHR. And I think we just have to talk about, the fact that abortions are one of the safest, easiest, simplest, cheapest medical interventions, period, right? And they can actually happen at secondary or a tertiary health facility intervention. They are really basic medical techniques that you need as a doctor, as a nurse to be trained in. And so all of this fuss around abortions is also part of the patriarchy. It is part of what the anti-rights movement want to drum up, right? And exaggerate in terms of what it means. And just the other day I was reading that some doctors somewhere, were being reported, for various ways in which they are denying people abortion care, which we know is something that happens a lot in this context of criminalization. Like Kirigo was saying, if you're going to criminalize abortion care, you're going to criminalize the right to choice. It's very a short space of time before doctors and nurses are criminalized for actually doing the medical procedure. And so that's the problem with using criminalization as well in healthcare and in health settings. So abortions remain safe, and they remain an acceptable form of ending a pregnancy if you don't want to be pregnant. And it's a matter of training health and care workers to understand their role, to respect rights, and to also then be offered the training to be able to give this service in a safe manner. And my deep appreciation to both you, Kerigo and Michelle, for joining me for this conversation on how we innovate and not accommodate. And I think at the very least, having conversations that are open and honest is the very first step of how we actually start to innovate, and how we build and create strong movements that will stand some of these external pressures is very important thing, and how we locate these very important conversations within the political arena, because they are really political, and they are front and center of our everyday lives. And so, Michelle, I want to give you your sort of wrapping up moment, so that when I go to Kirigo, she's going to do that and then share her poem, and then I'm going to go into closing remarks. And just to say thank you again for everyone who joins us for this series, and who has stayed with us for this particular conversation. So over to you, Michelle, for your final thoughts, and then I will hand over to Kirigo.
Sure. Thank you so much, Dr. T. And also to Kirigo. I thought my wrap up would firstly focus on how precious this opportunity is, because as much as we say we're a global movement, how often is it somebody from Southeast Asia is able to actually connect with all of you doing your work in your part of the world and really sharing the deep progresses and also the barriers that we've met. And I also do think that there's not much time being taken for those of us have benefited from the hard work from other parts of the world to actually just say a big thank you, because a lot of the jurisprudence that has been generated from your part of the world is being used in our countries, is still being used to fight the good fight. And also the amount and the just the difficulty being borne by activists from the African continent. For example, just making the information about the Family Watch and the anti-rights movement transparent and available. And this is something that continues to mystify and surprise activists from Southeast Asia, from East Asia, the fact that this is happening and the depth of funding of the far right. I do think that I just want to take the opportunity to say that a lot of the hard work done by many people is often not acknowledged, and a lot of the heavy lifting being done by people is often erased. And what happens is in all parts of our movements, we tend to amplify voices that sometimes do not need amplification. And also, I think it's important that we take time to find and say just thank you for all the work that all of you have done. And then also the major part of it is that while we are in an era of cuts and while we're looking at the global north, the global south, America as a large power player, we also must think of what we're doing when we other people. Because every time we other people, be it whether they're from the global north, whether they're from the US or from the movement, we are isolating people. And so we often forget in the master's house of the oppressors, there are its victims as well. There are women living in the anti-rights houses built by men, queer people, and children. And of course, not just in the first world, but also in our own countries. And so I'm just thinking of the burden of bridge building is very heavy, but the alternative is bridge burning, which, as we've seen, has cost us lives. And so just wanted to thank everybody and just, keep building bridges together. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you for that. Kirigo.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and Dr. Fallon. First, I'd like to extend my appreciation to you, Dr. Tandeng, and the O'Neill team for having me here today. As usual, I always enjoy having a conversation with you, Dr. T. It's always inspiring and motivating. And also just to say that, yes, there's a lot that is happening in the world. We are all constantly tired. I feel like every meeting I get into, everybody's just like, oh, I'm tired. But I also want to say, in as much as all that is happening, there's also good happening around the world. There are people who are doing the work. Like Michelle has said, people are still trying, right? People are still trying to fight for a better tomorrow. And in that spirit, I would like to usher us into my poem. And this poem is meant to just give us hope. It's a poem that I read quite often to just remind me to keep fighting. And I think it's a poem that a lot of us across the world resonate with. And for us in this movement, the feminist movement, this is is a powerful tool for all of us, reminding us that we must constantly push, and we will still rise. And yeah, so my poem is "Still I Rise" by Maya Angelou. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? Because I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room, just like moons and like suns, with certainty of tides, just like hope springing high, still I rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard? Cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. You may shoot me with your words, you may cut me with your eyes, you may kill me with your hatefulness, but still, like air, I rise. Does my sexiness upset you? Does it come as a surprise that I dance like I've got diamonds at the meeting of my thighs? Out of the heart of history's shame, I rise. Up from the past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide, leaving behind nights of terror and fear. I rise into a daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. We will rise despite everything that is happening around us. Thank you very much.
Arise, arise, arise. Thank you very much. And it is with those beautiful words that I would like to take this opportunity to once again thank you as my panelists for joining me, Michelle and Kerigo, and to all of the participants who joined us for this panel and all of our colleagues for organizing and making sure that all the IT and everything works as it should. And hearing the intervention from today's panel has been inspiring, and I hope you have also been inspired in different ways of how we should not accommodate to a world that seems to be even more and more sinister by the day, as we must push forward and advance justice and equality around the world. And we continue to center sexual and reproductive health rights because they are an integral element of our right to health, but they are really important to show how the right to dignity, bodily integrity, equality, safety, and security and health are all human rights. The reproductive justice movement seeks to center the experiences of people who have been pushed to the margins, who continue to be made vulnerable by systems of oppression. And so we must continue to uncover, dismantle these systems and structures that inhibit and prohibit, but also create opportunities while taking away opportunities for certain people, while prohibiting access to conditions that are necessary for the equal opportunity to a dignity, to a life of dignity for people, especially related to sexual and reproductive health rights. And I'd said earlier that I hope that these dialogues, also the series, serves in some way as our intergenerational, intersectional feminist advocacy, how we use human rights based approaches to urgently adapt and adopt to ensure that all our efforts are successful in the advancement of sexual and reproductive health rights. And so I would like to invite you all to join us for another virtual launch of the Sexual and Reproductive Health Rights Strategic Litigation Guide in July, a project that I've been working on for the past months that has been, of course, supported and anchored by these webinars and dialogues that have been going on for the past few weeks and months now. So thank you very much for tuning in today. Look forward to getting more emails from me, inviting you to more stuff and giving you information as all of us explore different ways of building a more just and inclusive future for all. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very, very much.